In this video, you will learn to identify increasing and decreasing intervals on a graph. In these examples, when we think about increasing is defined as the y values increase as the x values increase from left to right. Essentially, you want to think of it as the graph is going uphill. So if I look at this first example, it's increasing here. And in my second example, it's increasing to this point and increasing from here to here. Versus decreasing is when the y values decrease as they go from left to right, but essentially it's whenever it's going downhill. So in the first example, it starts as going downhill, and in the second example, it's downhill in this little segment in between. Now, two other important vocabulary words to note is relative maximum and relative minimum. The relative maximum is the point in where the function changes directions from increasing to decreasing. So it's a highest point. So if I'm thinking of a relative maximum, it would be points like right here at Q and right here at F because it's the highest point. Versus a relative minimum is where the function changes direction from decreasing to increasing. So it's kind of like you have a lowest point. Now the fact that it calls it something like you have it P and T. The fact that they call it relative means it's not the absolute highest or the absolute lowest, but it's just in that area, it's the highest or lowest point. Versus now, if I were to talk about the absolute maximum, is where it reaches its absolute highest point. So the absolute maximum of this whole graph with this P would be this point right here, versus the absolute minimum would be this point right over here. Now, two important things I want to point out in terms of increasing and decreasing intervals. You always use the x values when you're running your intervals, and you always use parentheses, because technically when you're at your highest point, even though yes, it's changing and maybe a closed circle, at that point it's technically neither increasing nor decreasing, so you always use a parentheses. So in this first example, if I read from left to right, I can say I start at this point at -16 and all the way down it's decreasing or going downhill to this point at 16. So from -16 to 16 it's decreasing. Again, I'm always using parentheses. So -16 to 16 is decreasing. It's never increasing, so my increasing interval will be none. And technically doesn't have a minimum or a maximum, so my minimum and maximum would be none. For the second example, if I read from left to right, start with this open circle and it increases all the way until I hit this point here. So from 0 to 16, it's increasing. I could say from parentheses 0 to 16 with parentheses is increasing. It's never decreasing, so my decreasing interval is none. And my maximum minimum, technically there isn't a maximum or minimum here, so it would also be none. And in this example, if I read from left to right, I start with from this point here and -4 to here. So from -4 over to this point at 1, I'm increasing. So I can say it's increasing from -4 to 1. And then at this point of 1, it decreases down to here. So from 1 over to 5, it's decreasing again, always using parentheses. My maximum is at this point right here at 1 comma 3. And there isn't a minimum, so my minimum would be none. For my next example, I start by decreasing. So from this open circle down to here, which we're going to estimate is about at -3. So from -20 to -3, it's decreasing. And then from -3 up until here, it's increasing. So from -3 to 10, it increases. I have a minimum right here at -3, 0. I don't have a maximum, so my max is none. In this example, I start by going uphill. So from this point here up until, say, right about here at, I'll say this is at -1.5 to -4. It's increasing. So from -4 to -1.5, it's increasing. And then it goes downhill from this -1.5 down to 3. So from -1.5 over to 3, it's decreasing. So parentheses -1.5 to 3. My minimum is none, but I have a maximum right here at -1.5 comma 4. In my second example, I start by going downhill. So from this point right here down until here. So from -5 to -3, it's decreasing. Again, always using parentheses. And from -3 up until here. So from -3 to 1, it's increasing. And then it starts decreasing again from this value of 1 over to here. So from 4 to 1, it's decreasing again. Now, because there's two decreasing intervals, I put a U to mean it's the union of those two sets of numbers. And I would say it's from 1 to 4. Now, if I look at this example, I actually have a minimum at -3, -3, because it's the lowest point. And I also have a maximum right here at 1 comma 5. In this example, if I read from left to right, it starts this open circle and it's increasing the entire graph. So from -2, and it continues further to the right, it's always increasing. So I'm increasing from -2 to infinity. My decreasing interval is none, since it's never decreasing, and I also don't have a maximum or minimum, so I would also put none. And in this example, I'm going downhill the whole time. So even though it's an arrow extending in the other direction, I'm always going downhill. So I would say I'm decreasing from -infinity to infinity. My increasing interval is none because it never increases, and I also don't have a maximum or a minimum. So it's okay to have none for a lot of these. You're not going to necessarily have every key feature on your graph. In this example, if I look from left to right, I start at this arrow and the whole time I'm going uphill, so I'm increasing. So from this arrow to the left all the way to this point here, so from -infinity to 4, it's increasing. My decreasing interval is never going downhill, so it's none. I also don't have a maximum and don't have a minimum, so those are both none. In this example, I start by going downhill. So from this arrow down until I get to here. So from the arrow until 2. So from -infinity to 2, I'm decreasing. And then it turns and it's going uphill. So from 2 to it continues further to the right. From 2 to infinity, it's increasing. My minimum is right here at 2, -2. And my maximum is none. In this example, I'm going downhill the whole time. From this point here, I'm always going downhill. So I would be decreasing the entire time. So from -infinity, because there's no restriction on the domain, it's decreasing. My increasing interval is none. And I also don't have a maximum or a minimum. In this example, I start by increasing. So from this open circle up until I hit here. So from -2 to 0, I'm increasing. And then from this point here over to here, I'm decreasing. So from 0 to 2, I'm decreasing. My minimum is none. And my maximum is right here at 0 comma 2. In this example, I start with, I'm decreasing. So from here to this point here. So from -2 to 0, I'm decreasing. And then I start going uphill. So I'm increasing from 0 and it keeps going forever. So from 0 to infinity, I'm increasing. And then if I look, I have a minimum right here at 0, 0. And my maximum is none. This example has multiple intervals, but it's the same procedure. I start by saying I'm going downhill until I hit -3. So from negative infinity to -3, I'm decreasing. Then I start going uphill. So from this point over here, from -3 to -1, I'm increasing. From -3 to -1. And then from this point here down to over here, I'm decreasing. So from -1 to 1, I'm decreasing. I put the U in the middle for the union. And I'm going uphill again from here over to here. I'm going to say that goes to about 2.5. So from 1 to 2.5, I'm increasing. I have a minimum at -3, -2, and 1, -2. And a maximum right here at -1, 2. In this example, I start by going uphill. So from -3 to -2, I'm going uphill. So it's increasing from -3 to -2. And I go downhill from here over to here. So from -2 over to 2, I'm decreasing. And then I start going uphill again. So from 2 to 3, I'm increasing. And I put the U in the middle for the union. And then my maximum is at -2, 2. And my minimum is at 2, -2. In this last example, I start by going downhill until I hit this point of 0. So from a negative infinity to 0, I'm decreasing. And then from here to here, going uphill. So from 0 to 1, I'm increasing. My maximum is none. And my minimum is right here at 0, 0.